The text arrived at 2:13 a.m., 3 words on Jason's phone that split my world in two. We need to talk. For months I'd been tracing the map of our life together. Shared playlists, the same coffee order, inside jokes stitched into our evenings. Ethan and I had a kind of quiet intimacy that felt like a secret both of us kept reverently. Then, like a slow crack down a mirror, small things started to look different. He smiled at his screen in a way he'd never smile at me. He would come home later, smelling of someone else's cologne, and call it a late meeting. He became good at being present and invisible at the same time. I replayed the small moments as if they were clues I'd missed. The way his tone would shift, the way his eyes seemed to hold a private light when he read a message. I found myself waiting at my phone, watching the 3 dots appear and vanish, inventing explanations in the empty spaces of his silence. Was I too available? Too easy? Somewhere between the ordinary gestures and the long pauses, my certainty began to dissolve into a hunger of its own. When he finally said the words, when I cornered the conversation at the kitchen sink with the night gathering around us like a conspirator, Ethan didn't shout or storm away. He folded like a map, and the creases of his confession were quieter than the betrayal should have been. I made a mistake, he said, voice steady in a way that was worse than rage because it felt planned. He told me enough to create an image, not enough to explain the person who had been tender to me for years. There was a name, mark, and a handful of moments that had been offered, as if a private life could be parceled and still fit inside the life we built together. It was the way he spoke that cut deeper than the act itself. He described small details, the laugh they shared, a coffee he'd bought on the way into work, things that made the betrayal domestic and therefore real. I remember the ridiculous domesticity of it. The brand of coffee, the way the sun had cut across a conference room table. Those little images lodged themselves in my head like shards, sharper than any overt spectacle could have been. Infidelity, when narrated in the plain register of ordinary events, becomes a slow erosion, an attrition of trust. I didn't react the way I expected. There was no cinematic fist fight, no slammed doors. There was the hush of disbelief, like the world had decided to hold its breath. I went numb in the middle of the conversation, and then angry later, in the blue hours when memory replaced reason. The anger was not theatrical. It quietly rearranged everything I thought I knew about us. I started rewiring my days around the absence, pulling back from habits I'd taken for granted. I deleted a playlist. I stopped leaving the light on. I learned how to make a house feel like a stranger's apartment. What haunted me most wasn't the physical act. It was the way someone else had been allowed to fit into our mornings. It was the private tenderness shared in stolen messages and hallway smiles, the subtle architecture of intimacy that had been rebuilt without me. The real betrayal was less about a single moment and more about the negotiation of access. Who gets to be carried into the quiet parts of your life? Who gets to be chosen for the small tendernesses that add up into belonging? The aftermath felt like parenting a private grief. People around me offered platitudes in soft voices. You'll get through this. You deserve better. And none of them landed. Grief doesn't respond to optimism. It responds to ritual. A photograph put away, a box of shared things rearranged, new boundaries drawn like fences around a garden you no longer want trampled. I stopped sleeping in our bed for a while. I learned to be busy in ways that had nothing to do with distraction. I took up a pottery class. I read late into the night. I learned the slow discipline of existing for myself. Romantic tension lives in the gap between what you know and what you imagine, and in that gap I found something like clarity. In the days after, Ethan tried to make sense of himself to me. He offered apologies that sounded rehearsed, gestures meant to stitch what had unraveled. He wanted to tell me the whole story, to explain how he'd lost his way, to give me a chronological accounting that he hoped would be enough. I listened, not because I needed the explanation, but because I needed to know if the man I loved still saw me as someone worth staying for. There were moments of almost forgiveness, for reconciliation, for the return to an easier script. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table with coffee that no longer tasted the same and spoke about honesty and trust, and whether our history could be strong enough to survive a breach. I watched him the way you watch someone hold a fragile object, with a constant, apprehensive waiting. Every apology was an invitation to rebuild, every silence a test of whether the architecture of us could be reconstructed on a new foundation. But there was a truth I had to admit. Intimacy is not merely the sum of apologies, nor the return of routine. It is the belief that your vulnerability will be respected, not negotiated away. When someone has let another person into the small backrooms of your life without your knowledge, the question becomes whether you can reassign those rooms to yourself. Can you reclaim the ordinary tendernesses? Can you allow your heart to be private again, not as a secret, but as an intentional choice? I learned to be precise with my attention. I stopped giving everything away at once. Where before I had been generous with my time and explanations, I began to create small reserves, moments I kept for myself, because I realized that my presence had value and that value had been spent without my consent. Not out of spite, but out of a need to protect the life that I still wanted to be whole. This story isn't a neat moral or a tidy lesson. It's messy and human and full of contradictions. I still loved a man who had disappointed me, and I still wanted to be seen on my own terms. If there's a takeaway, it's this: betrayal reconfigures the map of intimacy, and rebuilding requires more than words. It requires an insistence on your own worth, an insistence that being present be a privilege granted to those who choose to honor you. If Ethan and I rebuild, or if we go our separate ways, the story of that night will linger as a warning and as a teacher. Tend your smallness carefully, and never let your quiet vanish without a witness.